The snow came down like it had something to confess. It drifted slow and steady over Frostvale Crossing, settling into the grooves of wagon tracks and the bent shoulders of buildings that had learned to endure without complaint. Winter had a way of quieting this town, sanding down its sharp edges, forcing even the loudest lives into whispers. That was how I remember it, white everywhere, the air smelling of iron and coal smoke, and a boy standing too still for his age outside the sheriff's office. Caleb Boone could not have been more than 10. His coat was a hand-me-down from a man who'd once stood taller in the world, its sleeves swallowing his wrists. Snow clung to his lashes, and still he didn't blink. At his side sat Valor, a graying police dog whose back was straight as a promise, whose eyes never stopped working. Even then, even hungry, even unwanted, the dog held himself like duty still mattered. People noticed them. They always did. Frostvale had nothing better to do than notice what didn't belong. Across the street, Elias Boone stood half-hidden beneath the awning of the closed telegraph office. He kept his hat low, as if that might stop the town from recognizing the slope of his shoulders. Once, he'd walked these streets with a badge catching the light, boots ringing certainty into the boards beneath him. Now he watched his son from a distance, hands jammed into his pockets, jaw set tight enough to crack teeth. A man could survive many things, but watching your child learn shame too early, that left a bruise no winter could numb. Elias had not always been this quiet. There was a time when his name carried weight, when trouble moved out of his way instead of toward it. Folks said he'd been born for the law, that something in his eyes made men tell the truth faster. Valor had come into his life during those years, all sharp angles and wild energy, a dog who trusted instinct more than orders. Together they learned each other the hard way. Elias learned patience. Valor learned mercy. The town learned to sleep easier. But towns forget as quickly as they learn. The fall came without ceremony. No gunfire. No public trial. Just a decision made behind closed doors and a badge slid across a desk like it was already ashamed. Some said Elias had bent to rule. Others said he'd refused to. Frostvale never bothered sorting the truth from the comfort of a good story. By the time winter arrived, the verdict had settled. Elias Boone was a man to remember carefully, from a distance. Valor lost his place the same day Elias did. A police dog without a handler was just another mouth to feed, and Frostvale was not a generous town when it came to the fallen. They took the leash, the kennel, the paperwork that made loyalty official. What they didn't take was the bond. That stayed, quiet and stubborn, sleeping beside the stove in borrowed rooms. Survival became a series of small negotiations. One more night before rent was due. One more day before the bread ran out. Elias learned the geography of his pride, where it bent and where it broke. He never let Caleb see the breaking. He turned his face away when he counted coins. He laughed when the boy pretended not to notice the thinness of their meals. Caleb noticed everything. He noticed how Valor always ate last, how the dog would lift his head at the sound of Elias coughing in the night. He noticed the way people's voices changed when they said his father's name, the way doors closed more softly now, as if to spare them both. Most of all, he noticed the look in Elias's eyes when he stared too long at the badge-shaped shadow on the wall, a ghost that refused to leave. The idea came to Caleb the way most desperate ideas do, not loud, not clever, just necessary. He didn't ask permission. He waited until Elias had gone out looking for work that no longer existed and brushed the snow from Valor's back with his bare hands. The dog leaned into the touch, breath puffing warm against Caleb's fingers. "Come on," the boy whispered, like he was asking a favor. They walked together down Main Street, past the bakery that smelled like comfort they couldn't afford, past the saloon still shuttered from last night's trouble. Valor matched Caleb's pace, slower than he'd once walked, careful with his aging hips. The sheriff's office stood at the end of the street, its windows fogged with heat and authority. Caleb hesitated only once, then reached for the door. Inside, the warmth hit him first. The smell of ink and old wood. Sheriff Thomas Hale looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his face before settling into something more guarded. He was a broad man with kind eyes that had learned caution. He recognized valor immediately. Everyone did. Caleb took off his hat the way his father had taught him. His hands shook, but his voice held. "Sir," he said, and the word felt heavy, like it mattered. "Can you buy my dad's police dog?" The room went still. Even the stove seemed to quiet, its ticking pauses stretching too long. Sheriff Hale looked from the boy to the dog, then back again. Valor sat without being told, back straight, gaze forward. A good dog. Always a good dog. Outside, snow pressed against the windows, blurring the shapes of people who had stopped to watch. News traveled fast when it involved a fall from grace. Elias felt it before he saw it, the weight of attention shifting. He turned just in time to catch sight of his son through the glass, small and brave and alone. Something in his chest gave way. Sheriff Hale did not answer right away. He saw the boy's chapped hands, the determination stretched thin over fear. He saw, too, the years behind Valor's eyes, the nights patrolling frozen roads, the times that dog had moved first when danger hesitated. He remembered a younger version of himself, bleeding in the snow, a blur of fur and teeth keeping death at bay until help came. Memory has a way of complicating simple decisions. "Wait here," Hale said finally, his voice low. Caleb nodded, relief and dread tangling in his stomach. He stepped back outside, the cold reclaiming him. Valor followed, pressing close, a silent promise that whatever happened next, they would face it together. Elias crossed the street then. He didn't hurry. A man learns things when he's fallen, how rushing only makes the ground harder. He stopped a few steps from his son, eyes searching his face. Caleb looked up, guilt flashing bright. "I just asked," the boy said quickly. "I thought maybe." Elias put a hand on his shoulder, gentle and firm. "You don't have to explain," he said, though his voice roughened. He looked past Caleb, at the sheriff's office, at the town gathering like crows. He felt the old familiar heat of shame, sharp and undeserved, rise in his throat. He swallowed it down. This was not the moment for it. The door behind them opened, spilling light onto the snow. Sheriff Hale stood there, hat in his hands. He did not speak yet. He simply looked at Elias Boone, really looked at him, and in that pause lived every story Frostvale had told itself, and a few it had forgotten. Snow continued to fall, softening edges, refusing to choose sides. Whatever answer waited was not yet spoken, but something had already shifted. A question had been asked that could not be taken back, and the town would have to live with the sound of it. The sheriff did not speak right away, and in Frostvale Crossing silence was never empty. It carried weight, collected judgment, remembered old versions of people whether they asked to be remembered or not. Elias felt it press against his ribs as Sheriff Hale stepped out into the snow, the white gathering on his coat like unasked questions. "You shouldn't have had to ask," Hale said at last, not to Caleb alone, but to the space between them all. Caleb's fingers tightened in Valor's fur. The dog did not move. He had learned long ago that stillness could be its own kind of courage. The sheriff turned, not toward the boy, but toward the watching town. Faces hovered behind windows, half hidden, as if shame were contagious. Hale's voice carried anyway. "Go on," he said softly. "You'll catch cold standing there." It was not an order. It was a kindness. Caleb hesitated, looking to his father. Elias nodded once. The boy and the dog moved toward the edge of the street, snow crunching underfoot, the moment suspended behind them like a held breath. Inside the sheriff's office, Hale poured 2 cups of coffee without asking. He slid one across the desk toward Elias. "You look thinner," he said. It was an observation, not an accusation. "So does the town," Elias replied. His hands hovered over the cup, then wrapped around it, grateful despite himself. Hale studied him the way a man studies an old map, searching for landmarks he once trusted. "Valor's still working," he said quietly. "I can see it in him." Elias's jaw tightened. "He doesn't know how to stop." Neither, Hale thought, did the man in front of him. The truth did not arrive all at once. It rarely did. It came in pieces, laid carefully on the desk like evidence meant for a different kind of court. The report that had been misfiled. The witness statement that had been dismissed because it came from a drifter no one liked. The tracking call Valor had made that night, dismissed as instinct, when it had been certainty. Hale spoke without ceremony, his voice steady, as if afraid that raising it might break what little balance remained. "I should have looked closer," he said. "I didn't." Elias listened, shoulders squared, absorbing not the words but what they carried. Regret mattered only when it changed something. He had learned that the hard way. Outside, the town shifted. Whispers thickened, then faltered. Maeve Carter stood in her doorway across the street, arms folded against the cold, watching the sheriff's office like she watched storms, patiently, without expectation. She had learned long ago that men did their most important work when they thought no one was looking. When Elias stepped back outside, the snow had slowed. Caleb straightened, hope and fear fighting for space in his chest. Valor lifted his head, ears pricked, reading the set of shoulders, the angle of breath. Sheriff Hale followed, a folded document in his hand. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Frostvale has a short memory," he said, eyes sweeping the gathered faces. "That's not always a virtue." He turned then, offering the paper to Elias. "The department never closed your file." It was waiting. Elias stared at the document, at his name written in a hand he recognized. Not a reinstatement. Not an apology. An offer. K-9 trainer. Handler. A role carved carefully around what he and Valor already were. Caleb made a sound he couldn't stop, something between a laugh and a sob. He pressed his face into Valor's neck, breath hitching. The dog stayed steady, accepting the weight of it without confusion. Loyalty, after all, was something you carried, not something you celebrated. Elias did not reach for the paper right away. He knelt instead, there in the snow, boots soaking through, and rested his forehead against Valor's. The town watched, uncertain what to do with a man who knelt not in defeat, but in gratitude. Elias's hand trembled as it slid into the thick fur at Valor's chest. "You kept me," he murmured. It was not clear who he was thanking. Sheriff Hale removed his hat. So did a few others, one by one, as if some unspoken rule had returned without announcement. The town did not apologize. Towns rarely do. But something loosened. A judgment eased its grip. Maeve crossed the street then, a thermos in her hands. She held it out to Caleb, who took it with both hands, eyes still shining. She said nothing, only met Elias's gaze and nodded once. It was enough. By the time they walked home, the sky had cleared, the cold sharper for it. Caleb skipped ahead, breath puffing white, Valor moving at his side with a new lightness that had nothing to do with youth. Elias followed, the document tucked inside his coat, its weight unfamiliar but welcome. That night, the fire burned steady. Elias laid out Valor's old gear on the table, brushing snow from leather, repairing what time had worn. Caleb watched, learning without being told that dignity was not something given, but something reclaimed, piece by piece. I remember thinking then how strange it was that the smallest voices often asked the bravest questions. How loyalty, when tested, did not grow louder, only deeper. Frostvale would talk about that winter for years, about the boy who tried to sell a dog and ended up buying back a man's place in the world. But stories, like towns, only ever tell the parts they can carry. If you're listening now, it's because something in this stayed with you. Maybe it reminded you that worth is not erased by a single season, or that love sometimes wears the shape of patience. If it did, stay a little longer. There are more whispered tales like this, of dogs who remember us when we forget ourselves, and of quiet moments that change everything.